Emma stepped into the airport, clutching her boarding pass, her heart fluttering with excitement. She had never been one for luxury, but today was different. Her husband had insisted she take this flight for a much-needed break, and for once she thought she'd treat herself. Dressed in a simple yet elegant floral dress with comfortable flats, she approached the check-in counter with a warm smile. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I was wondering if there might be any available seats in first class. I don't mind paying for an upgrade." The airline attendant, a young woman with a sharp uniform and an even sharper expression, barely looked up. Her eyes flickered over Emma's outfit, taking in her modest appearance. With a rehearsed, condescending smile, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. First class is reserved for our premium passengers." Emma blinked. "Oh, I see. I don't mind paying extra." The attendant cut her off with a sigh. "We have a strict policy. First class is for elite travelers, business executives, high-profile clients, VIPs. She leaned in slightly as if trying to be discreet, but her voice carried enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's not just about money, you understand? It's about exclusivity." A soft murmur of laughter rose from a few passengers in line behind her. Emma's cheeks burned, not out of shame, but from the sting of being judged so quickly. She could have argued, could have mentioned her husband's connections, but that wasn't her nature. She was never one to flaunt wealth, never one to demand respect through power. Instead, she simply nodded, mustering a small smile. "That's all right," she said gently, taking her economy boarding pass. As she turned to leave, she heard a whispered comment from a well-dressed woman behind her. "Some people just don't know their place." Emma held her head high, refusing to let the words weigh her down. She found her way to her seat, nestled between two strangers in the economy cabin. The space was tight, the seat stiff, but she settled in without complaint, flipping open the book she had brought. Little did she know, her quiet grace in this moment would soon become the reason for the biggest shock of the flight. Midway through the flight, the cabin bustled with quiet conversations, the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop. Emma sat comfortably in her economy seat, flipping the pages of her book, unaware of the shift about to unfold. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the first-class cabin was a picture of exclusivity. Plush seats, fine dining, and passengers basking in luxury. A soft buzz went through the flight crew as a distinguished man stepped aboard from a private airport shuttle. Daniel Carter, the billionaire CEO of the airline, had decided to conduct a surprise quality check on one of his company's flights. With his tailored suit and calm demeanor, he walked through the aisles, casually observing how passengers were treated. A senior flight attendant, noticing him, rushed forward with a polished smile. "Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you on board today. How can we assist you?" Daniel smiled politely. "No need to make a fuss. I just wanted to see how the passengers are doing." The flight attendant beamed, eager to impress. "Oh, we maintain the highest standards, especially in first class. We're very selective about who sits up here. Just earlier, we had a woman asking for an upgrade, but of course we turned her down. Economy passengers should know their limits." Daniel's expression didn't change, but a flicker of concern crossed his eyes. "A woman asked for an upgrade?" The attendant nodded, laughing lightly. "Yes, she didn't seem to belong in first class. She looked ordinary. So naturally we denied her." A tense silence followed. Daniel's grip tightened around the armrest of the nearest seat. "Tell me," he said, voice dangerously calm. "What did she look like?" The flight attendant hesitated, sensing a sudden shift in his tone. Well, she was dressed very simply. She didn't seem wealthy. She took an economy seat after we refused her." Daniel's jaw clenched. A slow realization dawned on him, his heartbeat quickening. "Where is she sitting?" The attendant faltered, confused. "She's in economy, sir." Without another word, Daniel turned on his heel and strode toward the economy cabin. The flight attendant stared after him, her confident expression now wavering with uncertainty. Emma, still engrossed in her book, remained blissfully unaware as murmurs spread through the economy section. Passengers sat up straighter, curious as they recognized the powerful man moving toward them with purpose. And then he stopped, right in front of her seat. Emma turned the page of her book, completely unaware of the growing tension around her. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes shifting toward the well-dressed man now standing at the edge of the economy section. Daniel Carter had built his empire on discipline and excellence, but at this moment, none of his business strategies mattered. His wife, his kind, selfless, and extraordinary wife, had been humiliated on a flight that he owned. Emma felt a presence beside her and looked up. Her eyes met Daniel's, and for a second, confusion flickered across her face. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice soft yet surprised. "What are you doing here?" The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers leaned forward, sensing something was unfolding, something big. The flight attendant stood frozen, the very woman who had turned Emma away, now looking like she wished she could disappear into thin air. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched slightly, placing his hand gently on Emma's. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice laced with concern, "why are you sitting here?" Emma blinked, glancing around as if to make sure she wasn't imagining this. "This is my assigned seat," she said simply. "I asked about an upgrade, but they said first class was for elite passengers." A sharp breath escaped Daniel. He straightened, his posture exuding an authority that sent chills down the spines of those watching. He turned toward the stunned flight attendant who had denied Emma. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. The woman, suddenly pale, stammered, Sir, I didn't know." "That's the problem," Daniel interrupted, his tone now steely. "You judge someone based on their appearance, instead of treating them with the respect every passenger deserves." His eyes flickered toward the other attendants. "Is this how you handle customer service?" "No, sir," one of them squeaked. We didn't know she was your wife." Daniel's expression darkened. "So if she wasn't my wife, you would have treated her this way anyway. Do you understand how unacceptable that is?" The flight attendant trembled, unable to respond. Emma, ever the peacemaker, placed a gentle hand on Daniel's arm. "It's all right," she murmured. "I didn't want to make a fuss." Daniel turned back to her, his expression softening. "You shouldn't have to, Emma." Then, in a louder voice for everyone to hear, he announced, "Emma isn't just my wife. She is the co-owner of this airline." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The very passengers who had chuckled at Emma earlier now stared at her in disbelief. Whispers broke out. "She's his wife? She owns the airline?" The flight attendant swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "Sir, I truly didn't know. I'm so sorry." Daniel's gaze was unwavering. "You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." He glanced at another senior crew member. "We'll discuss her employment after the flight." The woman's face crumpled as she realized what was happening. Emma exhaled, giving Daniel a small smile. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said firmly. Then with a warm smile he held out his hand. "Come, let's go to first class where you belong." With that, Daniel led Emma through the stunned crowd, and as she stepped into the luxurious first-class section, she did so not as a simple woman, but as the woman who had just taught an entire flight a lesson in grace. As Daniel gently led Emma into the first-class cabin, the silence from the economy section trailed behind them like an echo. The same passengers who had smirked at her earlier now watched in stunned disbelief. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, embarrassed by their quick judgment. Others whispered among themselves, eyes wide with shock. The first-class attendants, who had been effortlessly catering to their elite guests, straightened up as Daniel and Emma entered. They immediately recognized him, their expressions turning from professional to slightly nervous. One of the senior flight attendants, who had not been involved in the earlier exchange, stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, please allow me to get you the best seats available." Her voice was polished, but there was an underlying urgency. She didn't want to be caught making the same mistake as her colleague. Emma smiled politely, still a bit overwhelmed by the sudden shift in attention. Just minutes ago, she had been dismissed as unworthy of sitting in this very section, and now the staff was treating her like royalty. As she settled into one of the plush, reclining seats, Daniel sat beside her, his protective gaze never leaving her face. He reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Comfortable?" he asked softly. Emma chuckled, shaking her head. "This isn't necessary, you know. I would have been fine in economy." Daniel smirked. "No, you wouldn't have. Not after the way they treated you." His tone hardened as he turned his attention back to the flight attendant who had denied Emma earlier. She had been forced to step into first class, standing near the entrance, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked like she was awaiting a final verdict. Daniel's sharp gaze landed on her. "This airline was built on respect and service," he said coldly. "We don't tolerate discrimination. Not against my wife, not against any passenger." The woman swallowed hard, nodding quickly. I understand, sir. I made a mistake. I deeply regret it." Daniel studied her for a long moment before looking at one of the senior flight supervisors. "She is to be removed from service upon landing," he stated firmly. "I want a full review of how passengers are being treated, especially those in economy." The woman's face crumpled as she realized she had just lost her job. Emma, ever kind, leaned toward Daniel. "Do you really have to fire her?" she asked softly. "She was wrong, but maybe she can learn from this." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He knew Emma's heart. She never wanted revenge, only fairness. After a pause, he glanced back at the flight attendant. "Consider this a final warning," he said. "One more complaint, and you're gone." The woman looked like she might collapse from relief. "Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I promise I'll do better." Emma gave her a small nod before turning back to her husband. "See? No need to ruin someone's livelihood." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk. "You always make me the reasonable one, don't you?" As the flight continued, Emma was treated like a queen, not just by the crew, but by the very passengers who had once judged her. The well-dressed woman from earlier, the one who had muttered that some people didn't know their place, now looked deeply uncomfortable. She hesitated before approaching. "I just wanted to say I misjudged you," the woman admitted stiffly. "I shouldn't have assumed things based on appearances." Emma smiled graciously. "It's never too late to change how we see people," she said simply. The woman nodded, clearly humbled, before returning to her seat. As Emma sipped on a perfectly brewed cup of tea, she turned to Daniel with a playful smile. "So, are you going to surprise me on every flight from now on?" Daniel chuckled. "Only if it means I get to see the look on people's faces when they realize who you really are." Emma laughed, shaking her head as she leaned back into her first-class seat. This flight had turned out to be much more eventful than she had expected, but in the end, grace, kindness, and a little bit of justice had made it a journey worth remembering.